So whenever I teach stuff of this variety, of this species, shall we say, I like to start off with a very serious scientific question that I'll put to all of you, which is, what to you is the difference between a bird and a potato? People don't know whether I'm being serious or not. I'm really being dead serious. Let's start off. What to you is the difference between a bird and a potato? Feel free. Birds move, potatoes are stationary. Anyone think of something else?
Birds have wings.
Birds have wings, potatoes don't have wings. No one's had flying potatoes thrown at them or something? No, go on. Good.
Birds are colorful.
Birds are colorful and potatoes are not colorful. Anyone disagree? Potatoes are colorless. Huh? They're different in color. Good job.
Kingdom.
They're in different kingdoms. Which one? The Kingdom of England and the Kingdom of France?
Sir, birds come from egg and potato comes from ground.
Birds come from the eggs and potatoes come from the ground. Okay, now we've come up with about 5 points, right? If you were to come up with these 5 points, you would call them, would you come up with a word for all of them? They'd be traits maybe? Points of difference? Yeah? Points of note? And those points would help you if you were the first human being on earth, tell the difference between a bird and a potato, right? Huh? Because you can eat a potato, most likely. You probably don't want to eat them raw. There are some birds you probably should not eat, right? So it's good, at least in that sense, to be able to tell them apart. Okay? Now, how many of you are zoology/botany majors, etc.? Ooh, lots of you. So now you know what the word for what I'm getting at is, right? Anyone care to give me that? Taxonomy. Classification, right? So that's the principles of classification. You find a way to tell a bird apart from a potato, and there you have the entire principle of classification laid out for you. Now, how would you classify different kinds of birds? Now let's get a little more complicated.
Diet.
Birds that fly, birds that cannot. Who said diet? What about diet?
I said that. Whether they're depending on what they're eating, carnivorous, herbivorous, or even grains.
Okay, now let's just take these two. Diet and can birds fly or can't birds fly? Okay? And let's go from there. Would they be necessarily useful in classifying birds?
Habitat.
Oh, now you're getting all complicated. What is all this phylogenetically and all this? I don't know. There's some tree here that looks like a lot of branches. We'll get to that. Okay, we'll get to that.
They wouldn't.
If you separate birds into, let's just take the flight thing, okay, for now? Because diet's a little more complicated. Let's say I separate birds into birds that fly and birds that cannot. What do I have? How many groups do I have now? Two. Is there anything intermediate? A bird that can fly if you throw a potato at it? No? Okay, they're fairly well separated groups. Okay, so now I'll classify. If I were to say there was the first bird, whatever the first bird was, I'm going to split them into birds that fly and birds that cannot fly. Can you see a problem with this?
Because the next set of classification would be difficult.
Why is that?
We have to consider.
Have birds only become flightless once?
No.
How many flightless groups do you know? Name 2 flightless birds.
Ostrich.
Ostrich, kiwi, okay, I heard that. Okay, ostriches and kiwis are poor examples because they're both actually not that distantly related. But let's say I took an ostrich and a penguin. Are ostriches and penguins close relatives? No, but if you pick this character, they would be close relatives, right? So picking your characters carefully and understanding where they fit on the tree and taking into account little problems like convergence are very important in understanding how you classify birds. Any questions about that? Okay? Now I say, now you know everything you need to know. Goodbye, go home. No, we don't. Okay? Onward we go. Why do you care about taxonomy? You should care about taxonomy because of this man. This man's Ramana Athreya, who's been caught in a very unfortunate pose here. So Ramana is one of my colleagues at IISER Pune, and he will lecture you with that expression if you don't care about taxonomy. But taxonomy is basically important to classify and differentiate birds, so you know how much diversity there is. And for those of you who are all interested in conservation, if you know how much diversity there is, then you know how to conserve that diversity, right? There, scientific cues for bird identification in the field, morphological, vocal, and behavioral. What did we get to? We got to characters, right? These are characters that you can use to classify things. And the reason Ramana is on this is because Ramana is one of the more recent people to describe a species of bird from this country, which is the Bougainvillea. Is that what it's called? Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's an eagle nest in Arunachal, and as far as I know, not known from anywhere else yet. Yeah? So, once upon a time, when people wanted to classify things, it wasn't always possible to go everywhere, observe birds, and classify them. So how did they do that? How did people classify birds?
By collecting specimens.
Collecting specimens, yeah. They had to sacrifice birds. They collected specimens, they compared them, and they classified them. Many people still are able to use those collections to classify and differentiate birds. Alright? Then this man, Gaddow, who is one of the most famous anatomists of his time and was an expert in bird dissection, would send requests that specimens be sent back to him in fluids so that he could dissect various aspects of their internal anatomy. Someone from the 1890s said that nobody better than Gaddow knows about the bird tongue. So he was a particular expert at dissecting bird tongues and figuring out what they were based on sometimes on nothing more than the anatomy of their tongue. How many things can you tell apart by their tongue? Anatomy. I certainly can't. So that's the kind of skill he had, and he developed a whole load of different characters that people use to classify birds all the way up to the level of species, even closely related species. If you read bird descriptions from the 1890s, they talk about the osteological and anatomical characters, usually based on what he put forward. So they dissected birds, they examined them in detail. Sometimes this could take months. And at the end of it, they would have a clear list of characters that laid apart this species from the rest. Sometimes if they only had one specimen, and that specimen was slightly abnormal for whatever reason, then those characters wouldn't hold up if they got more specimens. So then species got lumped and split, and bird taxonomy became slowly the complicated tangle that it is today. Alright, here are just some of the characters that people use to classify birds. How they use the carotid arteries, even I don't know. And that is a skill we're all rapidly losing, I think, in many ways. So there is a lot of use for a skilled anatomist. But more recently, people, including some people who work at this institute, use molecular phylogenies in concert with morphological data. So you collect morphological and anatomical data, you record their songs, okay? You can use proteins. Back in the day, now with DNA sequencing, you can use DNA, and you can build trees based on DNA that explain how organisms are related, okay? How many of you here knows what a phylogeny is? Not many, and most of them are PhD level. So let's explain that to you a little briefly, shall we? Can everyone see this? If I write here? Okay, let's just say you have a group of birds, okay? And you've split them apart based on a certain set of characters. Okay, let's assume that flight is not a problematic character for now, and let's just say we can split birds based on that. You've got two groups of birds, ones that can fly and ones that cannot, okay? If I were to represent the first bird on this point, then you have a two split, yeah? And the two splits give you two groups. What are our two groups again? Fly and cannot fly, okay? These would now be referred to in the systematics terminology as clades. Okay? A clade is a group of birds that not necessarily share a trait, but share a common ancestor. And we can define that common ancestor based on a trait or on their DNA, which is what most modern people do. Okay, so now let's just say we've separated them into birds that can fly and cannot fly. Now let's say we've got the birds that can fly and have long bills, and the birds that can fly and have short bills. Then we say birds that cannot fly and have some other groups of traits. We group them further. And eventually, we get down to very closely related species. So let's just say we've got the house crow, well, the house crow can fly, yes. So the house crow and the jungle crow here, and the house sparrow and anyone know another sparrow?
That's it.
Tree sparrow. Thank you. here. And let's say some flightless birds. We've got the ostrich here and the emu here, and we've got one penguin here and another penguin here. Okay? This is not an actual tree, I'm just making it up to illustrate a point. Alright? What does this tree mean? It means the house crow and the jungle crow share an ancestor here. And so do sparrows, whatever these guys are, and penguins. All flightless birds, only for this purpose, share an ancestor here. And all flighted birds share an ancestor here. And what is this guy?
Common ancestor.
Common ancestor of all birds, yes. The most recent common ancestor, if I want to be technically correct. Alright? So now if you see a tree, read it in time from the common ancestor all the way to the present, and you will know where the diversity of birds came from. And the closer species are on this tree, the more closely related they are to each other. Yes? Any questions? Because you assume that you can only trace them back to the most recent split between them, right? So that's more technical terminology to say the most recent common ancestor from where all these groups split apart. Okay, so now that I've gotten this concept across, we're going to muddy the waters a little bit. Alright, because everything in, well, let's just say biology or any scientific endeavor is not as clear as it looks at first glance. Why are things not as clear as they appear at first glance? Because if you are contrasting taxa based on a small number of traits, you can run into a few problems, right? Two taxa could have evolved long bills and then lost the power of flight, alright? You could get back the power of flight. Now let's just assume that we've invented a flying penguin, okay? So if this penguin was flying, and all these birds were flying, what would you do? Do you move the penguin up here when it's obviously a penguin? You can't do that, right? That means flight isn't a very good character to use, right? Or flightlessness is not a very good character to use to classify birds because it can converge. Okay? Who here knows what convergent evolution is? Who doesn't know, more importantly? Okay. It's when two groups of things independently evolve the same trait. Okay? If something evolved multiple times in different groups, then you can't use it very reliably to classify birds because you will make mistakes. That makes sense? For in this case, if all you used was flight, then your flying penguin would be classified with sparrows and the other penguin would sit down here. And that doesn't seem like a very sensible classification now, does it? So for a lot of reasons now, a lot of people prefer to use molecular phylogenies and to map traits onto these, or to use a lot of traits because the more traits you use, the less likely that convergence is going to drown out what your actual relationships are. Does that make sense to everyone? Yeah? Convergence can be a whole load of things. You can have analogous convergence. You guys know what analogy is, right? I think this is in high school biology textbooks. Yeah? Flipper and fin? Analogies. What are homologies? Hands and wings. Do very different things, came from the same place. Okay? So, when classifying any group of animal, or anything for that matter, you have to take into account the fact that animals can independently evolve similar solutions to the same problem. Flight is a good example of that, right? Ashwin's going to talk about flight, right? Yeah. Bats and birds both can fly. Does that mean they're each other's closest relatives? No. Okay? So now when we've gotten that clear, let's go on to say, look at these guys, okay? You've got sunbirds which feed largely on nectar, hummingbirds which feed largely on nectar and look pretty, right? Don't they look pretty? And you've got this drab spider hunter here that I think also feeds on nectar, but it eats a lot of spiders clearly, okay? So this is a good example of that because although hummingbirds and sunbirds do the same thing, they're not closely related at all. Alright? Whereas sunbirds and spider hunters are members of the same family. They're very closely related to each other. So you've got what you call homoplasy, which is then basically independently arriving at the same trait. Or you've got homology, which is then having the same evolutionary origin, which are two very different things. Alright? So, oh yeah, one of my favorite examples, hornbills and toucans. Okay, big fruit-eating birds, you might very easily think they're related, but toucans are actually giant versions of a bird group I study a lot, barbets. So they're just a group of barbets that has gotten really big and are, some people think, fill a similar niche to hornbills in Africa and Asia, but until we did it, no one's actually tested it with evidence. Yeah? So that's an example of where convergence can mess up your ideas of relationships of birds. So, because of convergence and shared characters, some characters may become less useful than others in classifying birds. Let's take, for example, the opposite. You can have convergence that messes up your classification, but what if you wanted to use flight to classify birds and only one bird had ever evolved flight? Everybody else shared the same character. So you have 10 birds that you want to classify, but 9 birds look exactly the same and only one is different. What are you going to do? 9 plus 1? I'll just classify that one bird and ignore the other 9, you run into a problem, right? That's because some characters don't change at all. And you can't really use those to classify birds either. So you have to find something that varies and that allows you to separate birds into smaller and smaller groups, and then add more traits that allow you to break up these groups even further and further until you get to the classification you want. Jaipal has these lovely examples about here. So in case you didn't know it, some swifts echolocate. I don't know how many of you were at Shirish's talk yesterday, but some swifts echolocate, and that echolocation can be a useful way to separate swifts. In fact, the genus Aerodramus was separated in part because these swifts can echolocate. But that does not mean swifts are the nearest relatives of bats. It means they have convergently evolved a solution to the same problem. Okay? So now let's look at some trees and give you guys some terminology that will be helpful later when talking about stuff. What is monophyly? Monophyly is just means they have a single common ancestor. Okay, a single common ancestor of all birds means that birds are monophyletic, right? You didn't have birds arise from many different things. But sometimes, when you take anatomical characters and you have a clearly well-defined group, when you actually look at molecular data, it can tell you something quite different. So, there's a group of birds called parrots, and when they sequence all of them, when you sequence all parrot relatives, they would seem to be monophyletic by and large. But if you included all birds of different sorts, you'd realize that this guy, Hume's groundpecker, actually grouped with these guys instead of with the crows with which it was previously grouped. So, when you leave out one descendant of the ancestor, it means that the group is actually paraphyletic. It means that there is a common ancestor, but that common ancestor doesn't include all species that you currently think it does. There are some species that are missing from this. Alternatively, you could have a group that you think were nice and homogeneous, like the crows. Okay? You would think, this whatever, groundpecker is a crow. So I'm going to sequence it and see where among the crows it is. And then you sequence all crows, you look at their relationships, and you realize this thing sits well outside the crows. Okay? So that creates a paraphyly problem. Alright? Which means you have to reclassify this bird. It is no longer a crow, because it doesn't group with crows, it groups with something else entirely. What did it group with? What was the last thing I said? Parrots. So now you call it Hume's ground tit or something like that. Or I think they call it ground pecker now, right? Yeah. They call it something else. Alright? And its family level classification changes. Sometimes its genus level classification would change. I don't think it changed with this one. But it completely changes your understanding of where this bird sits. Alright? Polyphyly is an even bigger mess. Polyphyly is a technical term for, I thought these were all one family, but they actually belong all over the place, and it just turns into a giant mess. Warblers, babblers are all polyphyletic. What they thought were one nice big family of birds are actually many different families. Some babblers are actually warblers, some warblers are actually babblers. the classification of both of these groups has been completely overhauled in the last few years, partly based on molecular evidence. So, for instance, here, this group of warblers that they thought was a nice little homogeneous group actually belongs to a lot of different genera. So if you actually sequence them, they show up all over the place. Okay? So, once you've classified birds, you make your lists, you have your list of names, and then you guys can all go out and find birds, and when you find them, you'll know what they are, right? Which school of taxonomy do you use? You could use a school that uses anatomy. You could use a school that, you follow a school that uses phylogenetics, these trees, and that determines what the relationships of birds are, and increasingly more modern ornithologists use these tools so that they can tell which group or which tree a bird belongs to, which subtree, and classify it accordingly. And then you can develop field guides and books that help everyone else go out and identify birds, and that's what we do. So starting with the Handbook of Birds of India and Pakistan, which I still think is a very valuable resource for everyone because it's one of the best books that has notes on behavior of all Indian birds. But the taxonomy has changed since then. You've had many updates. And now with Pam Rasmussen's book, there are even more updates to taxonomies. She uses traits to differentiate certain species from certain other species, and the species and the subspecies level taxonomy of these is always changing as well. So it's good to keep up to date or to use multiple sources, especially when approaching these for a study. But what taxonomy you use can to some extent depend on what school of thought you follow, and also what species concept you apply. Who knows what the biological species concept is? It says something is a different species basically if they don't interbreed, right? And the phylogenetic species concept uses phylogenetics and genetic differentiation to determine what the limits of a species are. These, again, this is a personal opinion. Many here may disagree with me. What your idea of a species is typically is somewhere in the middle, using both of these definitions in some way to determine what is acceptable as a different species and what isn't. And of course, that's why there's so much debate about whether something is split from another species or not, and what the species limits in each genera are. There's a big and ongoing debate. So at every avian biology conference you go to, particularly abroad, there will typically be a large and very lively debate on what the limits of a species actually are. So it's something that keeps going on and on. And that isn't helped by the fact that birds confound taxonomists at every step. Alright? Who here has misidentified birds before? I've done it all the time. Yeah? Everyone's done it. You could find the juvenile of something and think it's a new species and create a taxonomic problem. Okay? You could have species that vary across breeding plumages, and that's a different problem. Okay, there was a bird in New Zealand, okay, that's now extinct, whose male had a beak like this and a female had a beak like that. And Walter Buller thought they were two different species for like, I don't know, almost a decade before he saw them both feeding together. And then he suddenly realized what a mistake he'd made. So the scientific name of that, species is Heteroloca acutirostris, and acutirostris is essentially the name he gave to the male, I believe. So yeah, maybe he had a bit of a gender bias that way. But birds tend to mess you up in every single way they possibly can. All right, it's not just birds messing you up that can cause this. If you were a paleontologist, okay, when everyone was in a rush to describe new species, they would find one bone and name a new species on it, and then it would turn out to be just another bone of the same species but lying 3 feet away or something like that. And these taxonomic messes are still being untangled from the 1800s even. So they, and a lot of this was because, this is just a fun fact, biologists of that era were competing against each other to describe new species, and this could create a lot of problems. All right? There's others. I like that he's used this example a lot. This is the variable wheatear. They're actually morphs of the same species. The females look pretty much alike. Okay, I believe they interbreed. Yes, they do interbreed. And you can, if you're ever in Rajasthan, particularly in the winter, you can see all of these hanging out together, which we just recently did. So that's great fun. But they're all the same species, believe it or not. They're all variable wheatears by nothing. Oh, this is that bird from New Zealand I was talking about. I didn't know it was on his slide. But you can see the male has one bill and the female has another. And Walter Buller for the longest time thought they were different species. Alright? You can also have species that look very similar to each other but don't actually interbreed a lot, and which sound quite different, and various others. So with a lot of research, people can actually define species limits in warblers and tell them apart from each other. And of course, I pointed out character convergence again, and the ground pecker is another classic example of that. Yeah? What is this got? Oh, tailor birds. Yeah. There's a bird called a mountain tailor bird, which isn't really a tailor bird at all. It's actually a warbler that's had a long tail and behaves quite a bit like a tailor bird, but isn't actually a tailor bird. Yeah? Whether it's actually very behaviorally different, people who do a lot more work in the Northeast will know. Yeah? Oh, hybridization. Yeah, sorry, I forgot about that too. Hybridization can be a very big problem if you're trying to describe new species, because some species hybridize occasionally and produce very rare hybrids. Okay, Rothschild's parakeet, or the intermediate parakeet, which was described as a separate species, is now known to be a hybrid between two forms of more common parakeet. Birds of paradise are a particular problem in this way. How many of you know what a bird of paradise is? Yeah, you guys watch that show on Netflix, I believe, Netflix more recently?
Yeah.
Yeah. The different genera of birds of paradise can occasionally hybridize, and they created a giant taxonomic problem that, you know, an ornithologist called Erwin Stresemann sat and resolved in the mid-20th century by saying, no, that's a hybrid, that's a hybrid, that's a hybrid, and that can create a real problem too. Here are a whole bunch more, okay, and these are many people who have overhauled and re-overhauled bird classification over the years, and with modern and emerging molecular methods, we have better and better ways of classifying species and understanding their relationships to each other. And by most common consensus, although I believe some papers have changed this just a little bit, we've identified what the broad groups of birds are. All right, you've got basically basal to all living birds. You've got the Gallo-Anserae, and I'm going to go into extinct birds in a little bit when I start talking about evolution. But there were birds before these guys as well. But if you look at living birds, the basal group is something called the Gallo-Anserae, right? Galliforms and Anseriforms, chickens and ducks. Yeah? Anyone think of anything else that's included in chickens and ducks? No? Geese, swans, pheasants, quails. These birds in South America are called screamers.
No.
Yeah? Anyone's heard of a screamer before?
Yes.
Yeah, Google them, they're hilarious. Yeah? And then you've got another broad group of birds that includes phoenicopteriforms. So these are flamingos, grebes, yes, phaethontiforms, and petrels are down here. Then you've got pterochliforms and columbiforms, pigeons and pterochliforms. Anyone knows what pterochliforms are?
Doves?
Sandals.
One of my favorite birds. Yeah, you've got nightjars and swifts as sisters according to the most recent phylogenies. And then here you've got another broad group that includes bustards, cranes, and cuckoos. Okay, all very similar looking. No, they're not. But that's what a molecular phylogeny can sometimes tell you. You've got gaviforms, which are divers, petrels, boobies, pelicans, storks. And then you've got most shorebirds down here as sisters to the birds of prey and owls. And here you've got what you often call used to be called near passerines, which is strogons, hornbills, rollers, woodpeckers, and barbets. And their sisters, they used to be considered sisters to the passerines, but more recent phylogeny surprisingly found that falcons are actually down here. They're not grouped with other birds of prey. They're sister to passerines, songbirds, perching birds, and parrots. And if you want something really interesting that happens here, these are the groups of birds that learned their vocalizations. So they're sister to each other. So somewhere along the way, the ability to learn vocalizations evolved, and passerine birds took it much further to evolve a lot of different types of song, which I think you will hear about at some point in more detail. Okay? So, again, just to recap, they found that chickens and ducks are basal to all living birds. Yeah? Grebes and flamingos, which clearly don't look anything alike, are actually sister taxa, although they do share some osteological characters, I believe. Storks are distinct from all other water birds, okay? Which makes some sense because storks don't have a vocal apparatus, but that's probably the only differentiating factor of storks from many other water birds. Yeah? the true, then of course, if you look within groups like the accipitriforms, you find all sorts of little weird, interesting things like that the bearded vulture and the Egyptian vulture aren't really true vultures at all. So scavenging appears to have evolved multiple times in birds of prey. Yeah? Of course, the button quail is another of my favorite. Everyone thought the button quail was a quail, except it isn't. Even if you look at it osteologically or if you use molecular evidence, it's actually more closely related to shorebirds. So it has convergent characters with chickens, but it's not a chicken. Yeah? Bustards have been separated from cranes and rails. Yeah? Sandgrouse are a mess. Nobody knows which ones they are. Right now they think they're an order that's a sister to pigeons, but who knows, the next phylogeny that uses even more data might actually find them going back next to waders. So sandgrouse have created taxonomic problems for decades that we're only just starting to get a handle on. Yeah? Falcons and parrots. That photo really makes them look very similar, but they're not. Yeah? Okay, I'm just going to go through these really quickly. I think you guys will get this presentation maybe, so, because I don't want to. Yeah, this is one of the things I was talking about earlier. Some warblers are babblers, some babblers are warblers, the whole thing is a mess. Right? Okay, does anyone have questions here before I go on to the next one? Yeah.